Welcome to That Jewish News Show. I'm Laura E. Adkins, the Forward's opinion editor.
And I'm Benyamin Cohen, our news director.
Today is, very excitingly, our first day as both a video and audio podcast. If you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review That Jewish News Show. If you're listening live on Facebook or YouTube, welcome back.
And today we have a very special guest we're really looking forward to. We're going to have, coming up in a few minutes, we're going to be speaking with Ben Smith. He's the co-founder of Semafor. He's the founding editor-in-chief of Buzzfeed News. He's used to work for the New York Times, and he was a former intern at the Forward. That's where he got his start. So I look forward to talking to him about that. And he has a new book out called Traffic, Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion in the billion-dollar race to go viral. It's all about the rise and fall of a bunch of different internet websites and kind of the whole future of journalism. So hopefully we'll have a really good conversation with Ben. But first, we want to talk about some of the news of the week before Ben comes on. And one of the big stories we've been following is this week was the beginning of the trial of the shooter. The Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue shooting was in October 2018. If you can believe, it's been over 4 years. It's the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in United States history. And finally, the shooter is, the trial started this week with jury deliberations in Pittsburgh. And the trial is expected to last we thought it was 3 months. The judge this week said it could be as long as 4 months. And really what we're watching for, the storyline we're watching for is not whether or not he's going to be found guilty. I think most legal experts think that's what's going to happen. The question is more what's going to be the punishment. Is it going to be life in prison, or is it going to be the death penalty? It's interesting. The lawyer who's representing the gunman, she's previously represented other high-profile attackers like the Unabomber and the Boston Marathon bomber. And so she has, gotten some people off of death row. And the backdrop for this is they've spoken to the victims' families, and 7 of the 9 victim families in this case, in the Pittsburgh case, support the death penalty. We posted an interview this week with Diane Rosenthal, who lost 2 of her brothers in the massacre. And she said, really, the death penalty is needed. To quote, she said, to offer some measure of deterrence from horrific hate crimes happening again and again. So it's kind of, it's a really interesting debate. Laura, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's wild that we're just now getting to this trial. I mean, I remember 2018, what it was like experiencing that event both as a Jewish journalist and a Jewish American. It was really, for me, the first time my sense of self and safety as specifically a Jewish American felt shattered. I remember, jumping into reporting mode while I was also out of town for a friend's wedding. They broke 2 glasses under the chuppah, one, the traditional one, remembering Jerusalem, and the other one for the victims. And it was just such an emotional moment. And I think that the families of the victims are really looking for closure, and that's a hard thing to accomplish. And the death penalty itself is a really complicated issue in Jewish thought. In theory, Jewish law never shies away from the death penalty. It's prescribed for many things as varied as, witchcraft, breaking Shabbat, adultery. But the Talmud also refers to a court that condemns someone to death once every 70 years as bloodthirsty. And most modern rabbis and Jewish thinkers are pretty against the death penalty, but I don't want to universalize. But more importantly than that for me is, what's going to bring healing and closure to the families, to the Pittsburgh Jewish community, and to American Jews. And I think it's really unclear what the answer is. We've read, recently very strong opinions, both, from the families, some of whom are very for the death penalty in this case. Beth Kislev, whose husband is a rabbi who was serving in one of the congregations at Tree of Life on the day of the attack. She wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and has written for us many times before, strongly against the death penalty in this case. So it's really complicated. But ultimately, the big thing that I'm watching as we follow this case is, how is the local community responding? How is the American Jewish community responding? And ultimately this man is guilty. It's pretty clear. I mean, there's no real uncertainty there. And as you mentioned, his lawyer's main job here is trying to get him off of death row. So it'll be interesting to see the details that emerge and how the community reacts. But Benjamin, you live fairly close to Pittsburgh, right?
Yeah, about a little more than an hour south of Pittsburgh. It's kind of like I mean, it is my local Jewish community. It's the closest Jewish community to where I live, and my wife and I go there probably at least once a month to go get the kosher butcher there and the kosher supermarket there, and um, I was just there recently getting all of our Passover food. And the one thing I'd never been before I moved to where I am now. I had never been to Pittsburgh, and the only thing I knew about Pittsburgh was it was a steel town in the '80s, and it was kind of down on its luck. But when I visited there, it's like first of all, it's a beautiful place,
Yeah.
and the residents of Pittsburgh, and particularly the Jewish community of Pittsburgh, really takes a pride in the community.
Yeah.
And you don't always get that. A lot of towns have transplants and people who are just there for a certain amount of time and then move on. But the Pittsburgh community really, they've been there for a while. They take pride in the community. Everyone's always wearing Steelers shirts, and it's a real place of pride. And I went there in October, a few months ago, on the 4th anniversary of the shooting, just to see how everyone was doing and interview some people. I interviewed a survivor, Barry Werber, who hid in a closet during the shooting and actually saw his friend get killed right in front of the closet. And it's interesting. They at the same at one time, on the one hand, they're trying to move on from the tragedy. They don't want to be known for the tragedy. And so they're trying to live their daily lives and have a normal life. But at the same time, they know it's kind of like this tragic mark that's always gonna be there. It's like, when you hear the word Columbine or they hear the word Waco, I'm sure
Yeah.
the people who live in those places don't necessarily always want to be associated with that. And this, I think, takes a little extra resonance because it was a Jewish attack. And so, I think it hits all of us no matter where we live in America.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I remember particularly several people from Pittsburgh have expressed discomfort at it being referred to, as Tree of Life. Just that. Like, I don't know a better name to call it, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting or something, but
Because it was multiple synagogues,
it was multiple synagogues, but
congregations.
also it's very ironic, first of all, for Tree of Life to be so associated with death. But second of all, I mean, what I was most struck by from the initial reports and reactions from people from Pittsburgh, from Barry Weiss to our own columnist, Hannah Lebovitz, um, exactly what you described, this idyllic community where everyone left their doors unlocked, knew each other, that had, just never experienced something like this before. And I have a dear friend who is a reporter in Pittsburgh, and he shared candidly what it felt like for national media to swarm the place with so little disregard for the community and for the people who had built their lives there. And I mean, I am hoping that doesn't happen with the reporting and coverage of this trial. It seems like people in the 4 years since have gained a little bit of sensitivity for how to cover communities. Maybe I'm a bit optimistic, but I do hope that, again, we're focusing on how the community itself is reacting. But I mean, the significance outside of the community. I mean, I don't know for you, Benjamin, you're a little bit older than me, but did it shake your sense of security and self as a Jewish American. Like, I felt that so acutely as it was happening.
Sure. I'll go one step further. So I live in a small town south of Pittsburgh called Morgantown, and the one congregation here is a Reformed congregation, and it's called Tree of Life. And so
Mm,
when I first heard that there was a Tree of Life shooting, I thought it was the Tree of Life here,
wow.
in my backyards. I didn't
Wow.
even, yeah, like yeah, it really did hit home. And yeah, I was just we were talking about the Pittsburgh community. They're really an exemplar of what a Jewish community in America should be. Like the Squirrel Hill neighborhood is really home to Reform, Conservative,
Yeah.
Orthodox, Chabad. Like it's just home to a cornucopia of
Yeah.
of Jews, and they really, it happened. It happened at one synagogue, but the whole community really just kind of took it on as their own tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also kicked off these debates that the Jews of Europe have kind of rolled their
Right.
eyes at because they've been dealing with this for so long. I mean, as I mentioned, I had a friend's wedding the day after the shooting in Boston, and it was the first time I'd ever seen police officers outside of a synagogue in the United States. And I had a very emotional reaction to that. I definitely was tearful, and I didn't know whether that was out of gratitude that we're such a beloved minority that it's so easy for us to get security presence, or at the unfortunate reality, probably both. But it also reminded me, Jeffrey Goldberg wrote this seminal essay in The Atlantic in 2015 called "Is It Time for the Jews to Leave Europe?" And he really kind of looks at this security culture and, how secure are the Jews in Europe. And, I think that's a conversation that American Jews increasingly have had. I don't want to make it too political, but certainly had during the Trump era, and certainly had even more so after the attack. And I think it kicked off a lot of investment in security conversations and literal physical security within the community. Um, so I think it started necessary conversations. And, it also kind of opened our eyes to, and we'll get into this a little bit with our interview with Ben, but it definitely highlighted for me, and I think for many others, the danger of online extremism in the real world and the spillover effect. The shooter of the Pittsburgh massacre was very much inspired by online extremism, and Jewish organizations and reporters have been highlighting this for years, but this was the first time I think the Jewish organizational community really took that sort of online rhetoric seriously and connected it to threats against actual Jewish lives. So it certainly kicked off a lot of conversations that were very necessary in the community. But I mean, also just trying to center the victims here. I mean, it was every single one of those people. For those who remember the attack, it was, I mean, I'll say thankfully, it was thankfully early enough in the day that it was really only the dedicated core congregants who showed up early, and every single one of these individuals who were killed were stalwarts of the community. And I think there's something about that fact in particular. And any mass shooting is obviously a horrific tragedy, but seeing these, old, dedicated
Right.
Jews who were, making this small community thrive be the first victims of this, I think that was particularly heartbreaking.
Yeah. I've always, we have, we've had cops in front of synagogues for many years, even prior to the Pittsburgh massacre. And, I think it helps the congregants feel safe. Oh, there's a police person outside watching, but you know, it's not an unbreakable barrier. It's not the White House. They could go in a
Yeah.
back door or whatever. So,
Yeah.
but we're
I
going to be
mean,
talking. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I mean, this is the tension that the Texas synagogue hostage crisis a few years later really brought into sharp relief. I mean, the rabbi
Right.
let this man in because that's what Jews do. We let people in who need safety. And ultimately he ended up trying to hurt people. But thankfully, again, this synagogue security investment and training that the community had invested so heavily in after the Pittsburgh shooting ended up thankfully saving Jewish lives.
Yeah. So, like we said at the beginning, top of the show, this is a 3-month trial in Pittsburgh. So, we're going to be talking more about it on future episodes. And we would like to bring on our guest now. Hello, Ben. How are you?
Good. Thanks
Ben
for
is
having me
boozing, it
on.
seems.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hello,
we can hear
yes. Good morning.
you. There's a lot of chaos going on in the media and tech right now, and Ben Smith, whose new book Traffic details the dizzying rise and sometimes demise of media titans and traffic, above all, has worked at companies like Huffington Post and Buzzfeed. And last week, Buzzfeed announced it was shuttering its news division. And since early 2020, since the fall of 2022, you've been running Semafor. And so first of all, I want to welcome you to the show and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a former Forward intern.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
that's what I want. Well, I wanted to get to that before we get into the big issues of the day, the important issues of the day. Yeah, we heard you were an intern here way before both of our tenures here, and we did some digging. Thanks to
Did you
our
find the
editor.
Jewish genetic diseases issue?
No, what
Don't
was
think
that?
so.
I believe I contributed to it. I can't remember the details.
So basically, you discovered we do have genetic diseases.
Newsflash, yes.
No, I found a story. We found a story you did about an 88-year-old apothecary who dispensed shark cartilage to soothe arthritis. And another one was a diamond merchant selling baseball cards featuring biblical figures.
That I remember.
You did. It was a Pulitzer Prize. To tell us about how did your experience at the Forward shape your philosophy as a journalist?
I just fell in love with reporting. Honestly, I was an intern, and it was back when not only did you not pay your interns, you didn't you would know there were just a zillion interns. Anybody could be an intern. They were not paid. And then it was just sort of a jump ball all the time. And like, hey, would somebody do a story about this? And I just kind of always said yes. And Seth Lipsky, who was the editor at the time, sort of obsessed with scoops and with political journalism. And, and we, and I love that, like just the sort of kind of troublemaking aspect of it in a way, the willingness to challenge, actually particularly kind of communal institutions. Like there was a lot of publishing details from the 990s of Jewish nonprofits that really freaked them out. And for whatever perverse reason, I found very interesting.
Yeah, I think that gumshoe reporting has definitely been a hallmark of a lot of the work that you've done. And right now, the entire industry, it's no surprise to you or anyone listening, the entire industry is in the midst of a dramatic upheaval in the way we consume and produce news. Tech is roiling, the algorithms on social media are constantly changing. The future is perhaps bleak, definitely uncertain. What do these seismic shifts mean, particularly for smaller newsrooms, from the one that you're running to more communal-based papers like ours?
I think what's really happening is this social media era, which kind of upended everything and that BuzzFeed was so central to, is coming to an end. And I do think for that kind of direct relationship that the Forward has with its audience is probably kind of coming back in a way. Like I think it's good. I think for outlets that have communities that have direct connections to their audiences, I think that's going to be the thing that proves valuable, and in clear senses of their own identity, which the Forward has this long history that it's informed by.
Yeah. On the flip side of that, I think, the week's news centered, I think, on Fox's firing of Tucker Carlson, who, in his own, I would say, dark way, very much communicated to viewers that sort of relationship of speaking directly to them, sometimes their worst impulses. He was wildly popular and provocative, and he also trafficked in conspiracy mongering and race baiting. So he definitely benefited, I think, from this social media era. And he also fueled this vicious cycle where extremist views and conspiracy theories were amplified and spread online, and particularly on social media. Does Carlson's firing to you represent, maybe optimistically, represent Fox realizing that he'd gone too far and that there are real dangers here? Or was it simply them trying to cover themselves given the discrimination lawsuit in which he's embroiled?
There's still sort of a reporting question that has not really been answered on exactly which thing led to his firing. I mean, I find the notion that Rupert Murdoch, age 92 and a half, wakes up one morning and says, hey, I think some of what we're doing is bad for society, and maybe we should reevaluate everything I've been doing for the previous 75 years, seems extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
And maybe it was that they've been in a series of crises, but also they're just it's a very strange company run by a very elderly man who's made a series of very rapid choices in the last few months. They were about to merge Fox Corp and News Corp, called it off. He got engaged and called off the engagement very quickly, and then he fired Tucker Carlson. I mean, who knows? But I think the impact is real. Like, Fox is essentially the most important institution in the Republican Party, kind of an arm of the Republican Party. And Carlson, and usually it is populated by essentially kind of Republican Party apparatchiks who are trying to help the Republican Party within a certain kind of boundaries. And Carlson was not that. Like, he was leading this populist movement out into the fringe and away from all that. And so I think it makes a big difference that he's gone.
Yeah. What do you think these populist movements, whether they exist online or outside of traditional platforms, Jewish organizations have been warning about and tracking these organizations or disorganized chaos online for years. Is it more dangerous for minorities when there's like a very easily pointable to figurehead like Carlson kind of leading the charge, or is the more decentralized era that we're moving into a bigger threat?
I don't know. I mean, there is something about populism that always comes back around to the Jews. Seems like. I mean, I don't really think I have a theory on what's the more dangerous form of it, but it does seem like this sort of resurgence of anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, associated with this certain kind of populism, is you can't not see it.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked a lot about the importance of local news. You've spoken about that before. And I think you had a quote where you were saying, if there's a murder on your street, people are much more interested on the murder on their street than the murder in a different place. And in Jewish journalism, like at the Forward, we are a community centered publication, but it's not a geographically centered publication. And I know in your new book, Traffic, you talk a lot about what works and what doesn't work in the modern news business. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about where Jewish journalism fits on that spectrum.
I mean, I should say I'm not such a good Jew, and I haven't thought about it that much. And so I don't want to sort of overdo it, but I do think ultimately, like, it is about sort of finding communities and people who really passionately identify. And I think, like, certain kinds of, I think the more communities where Jewish identity is overwhelming for people is total, are actually the ones where I think the journalism is in some ways thriving most. Like, I find Yeshiva World News, which you guys may have bounced off, which is the sort of
yeah, they're very active. Yes,
incredibly successful news organization, because it's the paper of record for lots of ultra-Orthodox Jews. Yehuda Eckstein, who runs it, is kind of a genius media baron, and I think the challenge of like figuring out for people for whom their Jewish identity is one of a number of identities, how they connect is harder. But I think, I don't know. I mean, that's obviously that's what you guys think about all the time.
It kind of seems when we're, Substack is the hottest thing right now. And when I was reading your book, I was kind of chuckling at how this very scrappy Gawker era kind of seems to be just the previous iteration of what we're experiencing now, which is this cycle of, we get very centralized in news organizations, and then there's this upheaval and all of these new small places pop up. Are we just seeing a repeat of that cycle?
Oh,
and
yeah. I
what
mean,
is
media is not that complicated a business. We're not doing any like genetic
I mean, your book is 300 plus pages, so it has
Yeah.
to be a little bit complicated.
True, but really lively. Reads like a novel.
It does.
Yeah, no, I mean, like the pendulum swings. I mean, the most sort of amazing thing about this moment is that not only is it similar to the old blogs, it's the same people.
Yeah.
Like Andrew
Right.
Sullivan has, and Matt Iglesias and people who were the bloggers of the previous era are now Substackers. So yeah, no, I do think there's a sort of pendulum swing of decentralization, re-centralization. I do think there's also sort of a tendency that in all sorts of different institutions, away from people connecting to an institution and toward connecting to individual voices, whether that's in politics or in journalism. That's pretty real.
Yeah. It does seem, though, that we're missing this interconnectedness. For better, for worse, we're in a much more polarized environment. I mean, the idea of Ariana Huffington and Andrew Breitbart being in the same room today, if he were still alive, that's not going to happen in this iteration.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, the interesting thing was that the polarity back then was that like we were the internet people and they were the print people. And that like was a bigger difference than being left or right. And so the left-wing bloggers and the right-wing bloggers felt that we had more in common with one another than with our enemies in establishment media. And that has obviously totally changed, but you really does sort of put your head back into a totally different moment where Ariana Huffington, founding a left-wing alternative to the Drudge Report in the hopes of getting a Democrat elected in 2008, goes and hires Andrew Breitbart, who's Drudge's deputy, and that makes some kind of sense.
Do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better? I mean, we look at all these filter bubbles.
Everything, always. No, I don't know.
Universe tends toward chaos. Yes.
Yeah. So are you optimistic? I mean, we started as an ad-supported business. The Forward, other news organizations are nonprofit. Semafor is doing newsletters and events. Are you optimistic about where the state of journalism is heading?
I mean, I sort of think it's kind of deceptive to talk about like journalism with a capital J. Like, I mean, local news in particular is just like I feel like people sort of have priced into their perceptions the decline of the Metro newspaper. The great 20th century American journalism is organized from these huge metropolitan newspapers, incredible advertising businesses, and hundreds of journalists, obviously has collapsed, but actually it's still collapsing. Like the New York Daily News is like 80% of the way through collapsing, but still collapsing. And so these people are still losing their jobs. It's still getting worse in local news. I think in other areas, in finance coverage, in tech coverage, in Washington coverage, like things are getting like there's probably more people doing great journalism, certain kinds of investigative journalism. There's probably more than it's ever been. And so I think it's not sort of I don't think it's a sort of evenly distributed picture.
Yeah.
I have a 2-part final question for you. What is your goal for Semafor, and what does success look like? And separately, what advice do you have for people trying to stay properly informed in this dizzying and decentralized media landscape?
I mean, our goal is to, build a community of people who find us and our journalists and really, like a trustworthy, reliable way to get the news, to be people's first read, ultimately. And to do it by kind of putting journalists in the forefront and in a really transparent way, letting readers kind of connect with individual journalists, but with the kind of promise of consistency and trust that you can get from a good newsroom. And yet, I don't know. I think my advice to consumers is now just like kind of get off social media, which I can't believe I'm saying because I'm so wired into it. But like I have found that like the main thing I use Twitter in particular for was what is happening now. Like I would like to an answer to the question of like what's happening now, and not what's happening on Twitter, like what's happening in the world. And it has stopped doing that. Like actually, I specifically noticed it the last time. I mean, when Israeli domestic politics, was so. I mean, still is, but a few weeks ago was just so on a knife's edge. It just sort of wasn't in my feed, and I don't know why. Maybe I didn't have the settings set right, but for years, I would sort of reliably be able to go to Twitter and just know what was happening, and it doesn't do that. And so I don't know. I think they should subscribe to Semafor and read our newsletter. And of course,
We'll let you end with a plug. That's fair enough. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. His new book, Traffic, Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion in the $1 billion Race to Go Viral, is out May 2nd. Get your copies. Yeah. It is really a riveting read. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Nice to see you.
Thanks.
Both.
Take care. What a fascinating conversation. Are you more optimistic or?
Well, I'll say this. I was with my family over Passover, and some of my family and I don't share the similar news diets. And but it was interesting because we were talking, even though we don't share similar news diets, some things have broken through the barrier, and we were able to talk about things, and I was actually impressed. So this was not the typical we picture the Thanksgiving dinner with your crazy uncle and but this, so totally. I guess I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah, I was struck reading Traffic, and I'm struck in our own site performance. Buzzfeed's newsroom shuttered this week, but the thing that originally was the secret sauce, and the thing that ultimately I think will continue to propel BuzzFeed, is the feel-good cultural stuff. People like to have positive feelings, and as much as the outrage machine powers news journalism, I think we see also on the forward anything where people can connect to music and culture and a shared sense of identity that isn't at all political. I think that is really, really the secret sauce that holds it together. And I guess on that note,
well, I was gonna say, it's interesting you brought that up. If I can just share one thing, there was a famous study by I think it was Jonah Berger, who's a marketing professor, and they were looking at the most shared stories on the New York Times website, and they found that the majority of those shared stories all had something in common. They all had a sense of awe or discovery, because people wanted to share, scientist cures cancer, or something that was like, oh my gosh, I want to share this with somebody. Totally. People don't really want to share, oh, horrible thing happened over here. They want to share something positive.
Totally. Yes. And I mean, the story 10 years ago already, 11 years, I guess. I don't even remember what the story was about, quite honestly, but the New York Times snowfall story, I think it may have been about an avalanche, but the graphic elements were just so tapped into something deeper. And on that note,
we're trying something new. We want to end each episode. Laura and I are going to recommend something, or something we're watching, something we're reading, something we're enjoying, that we want to share with you. So Laura, why don't you tell us, what is your recommendation of the week?
So I have recently been obsessed with a new song from the Israeli musician Benaya Barabi. It's called Adam Hu Adam, which roughly translates into a person is a person. And we'll put it in the show notes, but it's a very catchy Hebrew song in which the artist sings about the beauty of every type of person that lives in modern Israel, and perhaps in the modern Jewish community as well. And it's just fun and moving and transcendent. On a heavier note, I've been following the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle in particular for their coverage of the Pittsburgh shooting trial. I would recommend following those local outlets in particular. They've been on the ground for years, and they've been a really good resource. Benyamin, what about you?
Yeah, I would second that, by the way. The Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle has been doing fantastic work around the trial. I was just reading before we got on today. They had an interview with the Pittsburgh mayor, who was the mayor at the time, remembering that fateful day. I've been making I made a promise to myself to try to read a book a week in 2023. So the book I'm reading this week is called A Fever in the Heartland: The Ku Klux Klan's Plot to Take Over America and the Woman Who Stopped Them. And I'm a sucker for history books that take place in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
That is very specific, Benyamin.
And I got a whole list of books I can share. But this one, it's by Timothy Egan. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He used to write for the opinion page on the New York Times. And it's basically about this guy who was in charge of the KKK in Indiana in the 1920s, and how he basically ran the town. He owned the cops and the judges and everybody. And he, had this public persona, and the Klan, actually, I didn't realize this, the Klan in general at that time had this public persona of purity and morality and, family values. And while he was preaching this, he was, behind the scenes, stealing money, having affairs, abusing women. And one of the women, one of the women he abused and ultimately murdered, actually, he did finally was put on trial, and that actually removed him from power. So it's a fascinating chapter. I was not aware of this chapter in the KKK's history.
Wow.
And if you could say it's a feel-good KKK book, because I guess you could, because in the end, the KKK guy gets what's coming to him.
Well, that's good. Don't spoil the ending too much, Benyamin.
Well, the name of the book has it in there, but yeah.
Yeah. On a lighter note, keep an eye on this podcast feed. Next Monday, we'll be dropping a new episode with an interview with the star of the new Netflix series, Jewish Matchmaking. Watch this space for that exciting conversation. And that's it for us today. Thank you for joining us.